So once again, I would like to welcome you to our first panel, International Perspectives, Combating Trafficking in Human Beings and All Forms of Sexual Exploitation, Strategies for Destination Countries. As we have heard from our opening remarks and the keynote speakers, it is really key to address issues with regards to demand for sexual exploitation in destination countries, as otherwise we will just be doing the same thing over and over again for many more years and decades as we have been doing. Then I will start with Elisabeth Winkelmeyer-Becker, member of the German Parliament, chair of the Legal Committee. Since 2021. She's a member of the German Bundestag since 2005, and from 2014 to 2019, she was the spokesperson for CDU-CSU Parliamentary Group for Law and Consumer Protection. In 2019, she became the Parliamentary State Secretary at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy in Germany, a role that she served in until 2021.
Ja, sehr gerne übernehme ich hier einen Impuls zu unserem wichtigen Thema. Ich tue es auf Deutsch, also bitte alle umschalten. Grüße Sie alle herzlich hier bei uns, hier bei der KAS in Berlin und bei IOM. Tolle Zusammenarbeit und grüße natürlich auch alle, die uns via Netz zuschauen zu diesem wichtigen Thema. Ja, es geht jetzt um die gesetzliche Lage und die Auswirkungen der nationalen Gesetzgebung auch auf die Situation von Menschenhandel und in diesem Fall auch vor allem sexuelle Ausbeutung. Und ich kann berichten über die Situation in Deutschland. Und es fällt mir nicht so einfach, denn sie ist sicherlich nicht das gute Beispiel, wenn wir das vergleichen mit anderen Ländern. Die gesetzliche Regelung macht einen großen Unterschied. Das erleben wir gerade auch im Vergleich zu anderen Ländern, die vor allem auch dem nordischen Modell angehören oder sich dem angeschlossen haben. Schweden war das erste Land und die erste Evaluation hat ja dann auch gleich gezeigt, dass diese gesetzliche Veränderung eine deutliche Veränderung in der Nachfrage, im Ausmaß von Prostitution und auch in der gesellschaftlichen Einstellung zur Prostitution gebracht haben. Und Gleiches konnte man sehen, als zum Beispiel Frankreich vor einigen Jahren auch umgestellt hat. Israel hat umgestellt, da hören wir ja gleich noch etwas zu, bin ich auch sehr gespannt. Ja, demgegenüber ist in Deutschland genau das andere Extrem gesetzlich geregelt. Deutschland tut so, sag ich einmal, dass Prostitution fast wie ein normaler Beruf gehandelt wird. Fast, deshalb, weil es einige Einschränkungen gab, im Jahr 2016 beschlossen, seit 5 Jahren jetzt etwa in Kraft. Und davor, und eigentlich ist die Grundhaltung, dass es ein normaler Beruf ist, der sogar mit Anmeldung und sozialversicherungspflichtiger Absicherung gedacht wird. Das geht weit allerdings an der tatsächlichen Praxis vorbei. Denn wir haben etwa 400.000 Anbieter, fast ausschließlich oder ganz, ganz überwiegend Frauen. Natürlich gibt es auch einige Männer oder Transpersonen, die auch Prostitution anbieten. Aber ich möchte hier vor allem jetzt schauen auf die Situation von Frauen. Angemeldet im Sinne von ich gehe der Prostitution nach, sind etwa 40.000. Also ein Bruchteil, ein kleiner Bruchteil. Die Zahlen sind natürlich alle sehr schwer zu validieren, aber man kann sagen, etwa roundabout 10%. Und sozialversicherungspflichtig beschäftigt, die Zahl ist zweistellig. Unter 100, aber auch da, gut, auf diesem Niveau kommt es fast nicht drauf an, ob es ein paar mehr oder weniger sind. Also verschwindend gering. Man muss sagen, die damalige Konzeption ist gescheitert. Deshalb hat man sich daran gemacht, vor einigen Jahren eben die Situation ein bisschen zu verbessern. Aber auch das ist im Wesentlichen leer gelaufen. Was damals eben beschlossen wurde, war, dass es diese Anmeldung geben muss, mit der Erwartung verbunden, dass dann eben die entsprechende Verwaltungsstelle mit derjenigen Person, die sich anmelden will, noch einmal kritisch hinterfragt. Willst du das wirklich? Warum tust du das? Gibt es etwa jemand, der dir einredet, dass du bei ihm verschuldet bist, dass du irgendwelche Reisekosten abbezahlen musst? Weißt du, was auf dich zukommt? Hast du deinen Pass und dergleichen mehr? Das sollte dort geregelt werden, um dann beim kleinsten Zweifel eben auch dem Hintergrund nachzugehen, ob es dort einen Menschenhandelshintergrund gibt. Aber wir müssen feststellen, dass das kaum Wirkung gezeigt hat, sondern die Situation ist für die große Mehrheit in der Prostitution unerträglich. Wir haben, die Zahlen habe ich genannt, davon etwa 80-90%, bei denen wir davon ausgehen, dass es einen Zwangshintergrund gibt. Zumindest Täuschung, Irrtum. Häufig steht das am Anfang und wird dann abgelöst von Gewalt und Drohung. Und die Realität sieht dann für viele so aus, dass man sexuelle Übergriffe von Freiern, mehr oder weniger ohne Wahl und ohne Nein sagen zu können, heftigster Art über sich ergehen lassen muss, so wie es Betroffene eben berichtet haben, so wie es Ermittler berichten, in einer Art und Weise, wie man sich das von außen sonst gar nicht vorstellen kann. Ohne Rücksicht auf Schmerzen, auf Ekel, auf jeden freien Willen. Unter anderem die Corona-Pandemie hat gezeigt, dass wir da vielen Illusionen nachgehen, vom Bild des Berufs, den man so und so viele Stunden am Tag eben ausübt, um dann in seine bürgerliche Existenz zurückzukehren, ist nichts wahr. Es gibt häufig gar keine andere private Wohnung, es gibt kein Konto, es gibt keine Krankenversicherung, also nichts, was an einen normalen Beruf erinnert. Im Gegenteil, diese gesetzliche Regelung erschwert den Hintergrund überhaupt aufzuhellen. Unter dem Deckmantel der Legalität gibt es gerade den Platz für diesen Markt, der sich hier etabliert hat, weil es so schwierig ist für die Ermittler, kriminelle Hintergründe und Zwangslagen aufzudecken, weil eben alles scheinbar normal und legal ist. Es ist so höchst aufwendig für Ermittler, dem nachzugehen und die Dinge aufzuklären. Trotzdem, wenn man eben wirklich mal ganz große Ressourcen einsetzt und sich mal verbeißt in einen Fall, dann kann es auch gelingen. Und dann wird auch einem scheinbaren Saubermann wie Jürgen Rudloff, der nun wirklich auch durch die Talkshows getingelt ist mit seinem Vorzeigebordell Paradise, auch ihm wurde letztendlich Menschenhandel nachgewiesen. Also das zeigt sich dann eben doch. Ja, ich denke, dass wir durch Verbesserungen kleinteiliger Art im System nicht zu Veränderungen kommen, sondern dass wir den Paradigmenwechsel brauchen. Ich setze mich deshalb mit Kollegen in meiner Partei, aber auch in anderen Parteien im Bundestag dafür ein, dass wir den Wechsel auch zum nordischen Modell in Deutschland vornehmen können. Wir brauchen dafür auch eine gesellschaftliche Diskussion, denn wir sehen doch, dass das eine Dimension angenommen hat, die uns auch wirklich gesellschaftlich betrifft, die das Frauenbild bei Männern massiv beeinträchtigt, die Beziehungsfähigkeit von beiden Seiten, würde ich mal sagen, vor allem aber von Männern natürlich auch beeinträchtigt. Denn ein Mann, der in der Mittagspause zum Blowjob im Bordell war, der guckt danach auch seine Kollegin und seine Chefin im Zweifel auch nicht mit Respekt an. Das geht einfach nicht. Und es wirkt sich auch auf junge Frauen. Alle werden ja damit konfrontiert, was dann das scheinbar Normale ist. Ich denke mal, das Auseinanderreißen von Sex und Beziehung schadet allen sehr und bringt uns alle oder alle, die eben auf diese Art und Weise an sexuelle Aktivitäten herankommen, um dieses schöne Erlebnis, dass beides zusammengehört, und schadet uns allen damit massiv. Mädchen haben eigentlich nur die Wahl, entweder hot oder invisible zu sein. Entweder man lässt sich darauf ein und macht mit, oder man hält sich komplett aus allem raus und hat dann auch nicht den Zugang zur normalen, unbefangenen Partnerschaft. Jedenfalls trifft das für viele zu und macht das sehr, sehr schwer. Ja, warum haben wir das bisher noch nicht geschafft, zum nordischen Modell zu kommen? Es gibt eine starke Prostitutionslobby, die unglaublich aktiv ist, auch in den Landesparlamenten und ja, überall auf allen Ebenen. Es gibt die ursprüngliche feministische Haltung. Diejenigen, die vor 20 Jahren diese Normalität eingeführt haben, denen fällt es sehr schwer, sich den Irrtum, den Fehler einzugestehen. Auch das macht es sehr, sehr schwer. Wir brauchen, glaube ich, eine neue Diskussion, die sagt, auch von jungen Frauen, die sagt, so wollen wir nicht leben. Wir erwarten eine andere Haltung von Männern. Neue Männer braucht das Land. Endlich wollen wir sie haben. Auch die Männer müssten doch mal sagen, dass sie sich davon distanzieren und sagen, nein, wir wollen Sexualität auch in der Partnerschaft haben und nicht Frauen als Ware benutzen. Das ist mit Menschenwürde, es ist mit einem modernen Verständnis auch von Geschlechtergerechtigkeit nicht zu verbinden. Soweit zunächst von meiner Seite, und ich freue mich auf die anderen Impulse.
Thank you so much for pointing out the importance of building an equal society. And this is where what has been initially called the Nordic model, the Swedish model, the French model is now called the equality model by most. So, thank you for pointing out the society we want to live in, and, the society that our daughters, and our sisters and wives and mothers should actually inhabit, where their abuse and exploitation should not be thought of as a regular job, something that's based on demand of specifically men who think it is their right and opportunity and ability to just go out there and purchase any woman at any time. So thank you very much for pointing that out. I think we are still having a technical issue with Ambassador Ekstedt. But before we move on, I would like to tell the audience online that they're welcome to post questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to address those to the speakers once everybody is done presenting. With that, actually, I would like to invite Mr. Eddie Mujaj, who's the Senior Advisor for the Task Force Against Trafficking in Human Beings at the Council of the Baltic Sea States, where he has worked in this area for almost 10 years. Previously to working for the council, Eddie served and here's another Swedish word, so I've mispronounced the Finnish and the French already. Länsstyrelsen, Stockholm.
Very good.
Working with the National Coordinator's Office Against Prostitution and Trafficking. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for involving the Council of the Baltic Sea States in this conference today, and especially our unit, the Task Force Against Trafficking in Human Beings. Very shortly, we are an international organization and a sort of political forum with 10 member states located in Stockholm, and we cooperate on different issues affecting the Baltic Sea region and its citizens, and one of those issues is trafficking in human beings. I'm also particularly happy to be in Berlin because in just a few months, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs will take over the presidency of organization from Norway that currently holds it. So I'm very happy to be here. And before I start my intervention, thank you to the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung and especially to ODIHR, because we have seen through the years ODIHR taking a very comprehensive but also, more than anything, a much needed approach when it comes to highlighting the issues of gender and demand in the context of human trafficking. So thank you a lot for that. Several speakers today have already established that the horrors taking place in light of the Russian war against Ukraine. And sadly, we are yet to see the end of this. And although us, the states receiving refugees and the migrants coming at the moment, need to have a long-term approach because this will be a long battle. This will not end soon. And although we should not be, or we should avoid being sensationalist and starting to see, human trafficking everywhere, we do see very clear indications and signs in our region already of human trafficking increasing, especially when it comes to Ukrainian women and children being exploited. I think of one example from Sweden, which is very alarming and very recent, I would say. In the Stockholm area, only during the month of March, only in a specific police raid, 38 Swedish men were identified for purchasing sexual services. Of those women victimized in this prostitution, 31 were Ukrainian women, which is remarkable in many ways, but it's remarkable because this is a new development in Sweden. Ukrainian women have, until that point, not been the majority of women exploited in prostitution. And we also see examples of, in Lithuania, where a prosecutor very recently initiated a preliminary investigation looking into a case with over 40 orphanage children from Ukraine suspected to be subjected to illegal adoption, which is also a very serious potential exploitation form. So Ukrainian children from orphanage homes are taken to our member states, and people and organizations take the opportunity to adopt them, in this case, to Western countries. And when reading and hearing about these examples, I mean, I worked with trafficking issues for 8-9 years. My first reaction is that, I have no words for this. This is so cynical for men, usually, taking the opportunity to, they read the same news and, stories as we do with women and children fleeing Ukraine. Yet they are at any point ready to, exploit these women and purchase their bodies, to meet their own needs. But when I think like that, I become guilty of a mistake that we do very often, and that is limit ourselves to saying, I have no words, this is an evil act, there's nothing we can do about this. But this is the exact problem. I think we need to find the words for this and call it for what it is. And that's the issue of demand, which I'm very glad, is being highlighted today. Because we know that demand is the factor that fuels human trafficking. And again, with the situation of Ukraine, we also see that we have organized crime groups ready at any point, and actually quite, with sophisticated organizations that they have and possess, to always supply the market, in this case, men wishing to purchase the bodies of women, and basically meet their needs. I also want to add that we see something in the context of demand, which is a bit worrying, which is also, more broadly speaking. In the Council of the Baltic Sea States, we finalized a 2-year project looking into how media and journalism cover the topic of human trafficking in our member states. It was a very interesting project where we had over 600 journalist students, teachers, and established journalists who are experienced in covering trafficking human beings. And we saw some quite interesting changes in our region when it comes to how media portrays human trafficking. And I think the first big change was trafficking has gone from being portrayed as an issue of human rights, where the journalists more often previously would go to women's shelters and NGOs to kind of get the main information and have them being the main source in the articles and the stories, to human trafficking going has gone to become more of a security issue and a border issue, where law enforcement is very often the first point of contact. And that's, there's nothing wrong with interviewing law enforcement. They have a very important role when it comes to anti-trafficking work, but they do not assist the victims. There are other actors that do that. But what we also see is that the issue of demand is basically non-existing in the media coverage. Very often stories look, even in those stories where they actually interview the exploited victim herself, they might ask questions such as, how come you were tricked? Why were you tricked? Like, which strategies and which modus was applied in order for, to get you to Europe. But very rarely the articles pose a question, who are, and I'm sorry to use this expression, who are the end users of this woman? Why is she here? What's the overall purpose of her being here? And that's men in our member states, in our territories, exploiting these women. Just as a final remark, we also heard about the Nordic model here, which is, the legislation in Sweden and Norway and many other countries at the moment. But I also want to highlight that there is something extremely destructive in the fact that in all member states of our organization, meaning in all the Baltic Sea region today, women exploited in prostitution are systematically reported if they are identified by law enforcement and do not have, so to speak, a legal stay in Sweden or Germany and so on. And I really want to, although we need to speak about demand and the legislation kind of opportunities there are to mitigate or address demand, we also need to speak about this, that very exploited women, exploited by our citizens, are deported. And this takes place in countries such as Germany, where purchasing sexual services is in fact legalized, but also in countries such as Sweden, where it is prohibited to purchase sexual services. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that remark. I would like to actually refer to one of our keynote speakers, Ito Hana Kundaya, who has actually talked about the non-punishment principle and not punishing the victims of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking for what has been done to them. So that goes very much alongside this. But I'd also like to actually mention something interesting, right? Where with the war in Ukraine starting, some of the largest searches online were for Ukrainian women and sex, Ukrainian sex slaves, and pornography produced of rapes of Ukrainian women. That's the big thing on porn sites now, pornography produced of Ukrainian women being raped. So this is just something that gives us a particular lens on society we live in, that instead of looking at how can we assist and protect, we have a situation where we have a lot of men thinking, okay, now I have access to more bodies of highly vulnerable women and children. And that brings us back to the conversation on demand and how we change our society. With that, actually, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Kevin Hyland, who is a member of Council of Europe, group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings. During a 30-year policing career, Kevin Hyland specialized in investigating serious organized crime, including homicide, sexual offenses, corruption, and headed London's internationally recognized human trafficking unit in 2014. He was appointed the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner, and in 2015 was awarded an OBE for his work fighting human trafficking. In 2018, he was the co-recipient of the Path for Peace Award in New York. He's a trustee to both Europe's largest homeless charity, The Passage, and Rahab, who supported trafficked and exploited women and girls in London. He had several international anti-trafficking projects, chairing the Responsible Recruitment Group of the Institute of Human Rights and Business, chairing the Island of Ireland Human Trafficking Project, advisor to the US-based Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and leads the OSCE development of victim support guidance for member state. And I could add, significantly more, but I'll also mention that he is one of the founders of the Santa Marta Group, which teams up faith-based efforts and law enforcement actually to have more impact. And he has been a great contributor to the work of OSCE ODIHR. And with that, Kevin, I would like to hand over to you.
So thank you very much, Tatiana, and thank you to the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation for organizing this event. But can I make a particular thanks to Atahan and to Leopoldine and to Mr. Kuliba for their presentations today. Your stories are more important and are the reality. But I think, as Atahan mentioned, we now have more international commitment on this through the UN Palermo Protocol, Council of Europe Convention, EU directives, many national pieces of legislation. We have a global commitment through the UN General Assembly. We have the Five Eyes Nations commitment. We have the commitment of the G20. And yet we still see this abuse of women, children, and men increase. And we see those who are earning from this profiting to 150 billion US dollars a year, which is a very conservative estimate, which was evaluated in 2014. And we see the numbers of victims identified around 110,000 a year, with the estimated numbers being 40 million. So less than a fraction of 1%. And then we see the amount of people who get prosecuted declining significantly, not because of COVID, because it was prior to COVID we saw that happening. About 4 or 5 years ago, it was about 17,000 a year to 9,000 last year. So whilst we have greater, perhaps, interest, we have less impact. And I think Mr. Heimalski mentioned a national action plan, which I think is what is required. And he also spoke of national referral mechanisms, which are also required. But national referral mechanisms, which come out of the Council of Europe Convention model, there's not one in the Council of Europe country or anywhere that really meets the standards of what an NRM is about. And I know tomorrow Tatiana will be talking about the guidance that the OSCE and ODIHR have produced. But an NRM is supposed to be proactive. It's supposed to be the state's responsibility for identifying victims, suppressing this crime. It's not about responding after it happens. It's supposed to be a place where people are identified, supported, and given pathways, even when they don't want it. And how that works takes a lot of sophistication. For example, some of the groups I work with in London will take many months or many years to assist someone to realize that they are being exploited through education, through support. Women may not realize that there is a better opportunity, particularly when the state's opportunity, as we heard, might be if you come forward, you're going to be deported. But then if we look at the international level, how much money is spent on this crime? If we look at investments into drugs, gun crime, terrorism, we are talking about hundreds of billions a year. If we look at trafficking, we are lucky if we reach 1 billion a year across the world by governments. And yet the traffickers are earning 150 billion US dollars a year. Therefore, it's an unfair fight, and one side is winning. And until policies are designed to strip those assets, to make anything where you profit from trafficking, where money is tainted, is taken away from you, then this is something worth doing. If somebody can recruit a handful of women and become a millionaire, and the chances of being prosecuted are less than 0.2%, so there's a 99.98% chance that you're going to get away with it, and the victims aren't going to be supported because they may be deported, then it's a good crime to be involved in. And the policies need to change. We also need to recognize, as we heard from our speakers earlier, this is one of the most serious violations of human rights. Not just because of the crime that it is, but also it targets the most vulnerable in our society. We see that in Ukraine at the moment. People quickly move, but then governments move slowly. We're still discussing responses that are weak on the ground in the borders in Poland, Hungary, Romania, or in receiving countries like my country, Ireland, or the UK, or here in Germany. Yet, all the criminals have to do is drive to the border with a big car and then drive back somewhere else. And responses take months and months and sometimes years. The criminals only have a car and perhaps a few thousand euros. Governments have billions. We're in the third richest country in the world here, and yet responses remain weak. So countries and governments need to own up and accept their responsibility. When I look at countries, say at the UN or recently at meetings I've been to, where they're congratulating themselves for helping people from Ukraine, this is a duty. This is something we agreed at the UN. This is the commitments about human rights. It's just the same as helping anyone who's in need. Yet countries move to the point where they're congratulating themselves when they haven't even written a policy, when people are still being lost in the system. We heard the stories in Ukraine where children and women are being raped, being run over by tanks. And yet we're already congratulating on ourselves for receiving a number of people. Well, let's put the congratulations to one side. Let's put our shoulder to the wheel. Let's start to make things happen. Let's start to ask our politicians what they are doing with our taxpayers' money. They have our money, not the other way round. Democracy is something that we all cherish. And we see what happens when democracy is taken away. But let's remind politicians, governments, that democracy means that we have committed at the UN, at the EU, at the Council of Europe, that we will do whatever is needed to help people who end up in trauma and traumatized and exploited. So let's go away and learn and look at, say, the reports that come out of the Council of Europe about our states and how poorly or how good we are doing. I don't know one country that really looks like it's doing a good job on human trafficking. Because as we hear, victims still get deported, women get lost in the system. The UK, that talks about a good NRM system, has people waiting up to 3 or 4 years for a decision. The waiting list is about 30,000 people, 3 times the annual number that enter it. Can you imagine any other crime in the world where if you were a victim, it took 3 years for the state to decide if you were a victim or not? If somebody was the victim of an assault or a sexual assault, or your house was broken in and you were told, we'll come back to you in a few years and let you know, we'd be outraged. So let's bring that outrage into the policy. Let's look at policies that work. Let's start looking at things that can deliver. And let's start looking at taking away the cash from the traffickers. There is lots of legislation, like the CBP Act in the US, the UK Modern Slavery Act, the Australian Modern Slavery Act, the French Due Diligence Act, and the EU Directive on conflict minerals. Yet, only last year, when the US and Canada, as a policy decision, decided not to buy public protective equipment from Malaysia because of child labour, the UK continued to buy it and spent hundreds of millions on goods that were taken from children being exploited. And that then kept those exploited children in the business of child labour. So how can the UK say it's acting against this crime when it's actually funding it? Now, Germany, as we know, is bringing in new legislation next year, which will be the first country in the world with a sanction to businesses that benefit from human trafficking. At the moment, if I committed a Data Protection Act or a company committed a Data Protection Act, they would be fined in the millions because they let our data out. If there is a breach of environment, there is fines, quite rightly. If somebody makes a mistake in a car manufacturer, the cars are recalled and there can be a fine. But if you keep people in trafficking and you make millions a year out of it, then all you do is create some sort of partnership. As I heard recently, have a lunch and learn session, do some posters, and that's seen as being enough. But we need to change that. We need to change it, that this is a crime that you cannot profit from. And all that profit, if we could create a way of tainting it, then goes to support people who need that money so that people can then actually see this is something not worth doing. But if you are unfortunate to be caught in this crime, you will be supported properly and efficiently. And you won't get nations running around patting themselves on the back when actually they are the countries or the funds that are allowing this to happen. So we need some honesty, transparency. And we saw that this morning in our speeches. We saw the humility of a survivor of this crime, who I think spoke about what a global strategy should look like. And I think her clarity that comes clearly from her heart, but also from her experience, is something that we should take on Mr. Momosky's example of introducing national action plans and a national referral mechanism. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for calling our governments to responsibility on issues with regards to demand, whether it is for trafficking for labor exploitation, but also on trafficking for sexual exploitation. Because we cannot say, when we know and we have reports, and I'm sure we're going to hear in the following presentations of what actually happens in the sex industry, that there are no trafficking victims there, that everything is as it should be. There are national referral mechanisms, and the updated guidance from OSCE ODIHR, to which you greatly contributed, that is available online for all of you and hopefully in print very shortly in a number of different languages. And many of the participants here participated in creating this guidance, and especially the survivor leaders on, whose faces actually are on the cover of the book, and, who are actually, whose guidance is actually reflected throughout the book as well, because it is important for us to act now, and to act within a certain set of standards, not to just say we're doing something. With that, I would like to introduce John Buser, member of the Swedish Parliament, rapporteur of the Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Issues at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And as Ambassador Ekstedt is not able to join us for technical reasons, we'll also speak a bit on the Swedish model as well. He was the participant in the OSCE PA election observation missions to the United States, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Albania, Armenia, and Uzbekistan. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and dear members of parliament, honorable representatives, as well as distinguished experts and advisors. I would like to start by saying that I'm happy to be invited by the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and it's my second time in this year as visiting the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, being a rapporteur of the OSCE as well. But as you also pointed out, I'm also a member of the Swedish Parliament since the year of 2014. And before that, I was also a youth politician for a couple of years. And I already noticed that we have made several references both to the Swedish perspective and also to the Nordic model. And it makes me happy, is not the right word maybe to use, but I think it's very good that we see now new countries shifting to what we call the Nordic model. I see on the screen there that we will later on speak about the Israeli route to the Nordic model. And also from what I've heard from my colleague from Germany makes me also glad to hear, actually, because when I was a youth politician, I went to a panel like this at a youth camp, summer youth camp, and I had a debate on, and the law at the moment in Sweden was newly established, and there was quite a, not a chaotic debate, but there was very much strong feelings. I was the only male in that debate, and there was a woman from Germany, a panelist, and she called herself very strong feminist. But when I told her about this Nordic model, the new inaugurated law in Sweden, not to punish the women and to punish the ones who are buying and exploiting women and children as well. She was really angry and said, "So you mean you don't have this problem in Sweden? You're just hiding your problems," and so on. So we had that kind of debate, and then I'm very happy that you also pointed out, Mr. Mujai, that there is also a problem throughout the whole Nordic Baltic region, which there of course is, but it's of course our commitments that are really, really important, what we do as politicians, and to see what you also said about the commitments to fight prostitution and fight exploitation of women, children, and also other crimes regarding to the trafficking situation. So I think that is really, really important. I would also try, of course, to speak a little bit out from an OSCE perspective, and it's impossible not to mention what is going on at the moment regarding the Russia-Ukraine, because as we heard before, many Ukrainian refugees are coming to our countries, also to Sweden, of course. Myself, I have friends who are my closest friends. They're actually taking care of a Ukrainian mother and her 2 daughters, and they live in their home, and this is the situation in many countries where we want to help a lot. Myself, I visited the Polish-Ukrainian border a couple of weeks ago, and it's so difficult to understand and hard to believe that the Polish society has taken more than 2 million refugees since the 24th of February, and that is really so hard to understand that we have this situation in our close region, so to speak. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the greatest violation of the European society order, which we have seen in modern time, and since also the foundation of the OSCE organization, I would say. And whereas the political implications can be calculated, the human distress, of course, is immeasurable in this perspective. We all see the headlines after headlines. There are headlines about the Third World War. There are headlines about new bombs, new attacks on civilians, on hospitals, and so on. But we also learn about the cruel and systematic outrage committed in Ukraine by the Russian war machine, because it is a war machine and it is a breach towards the international law, and that is really important to say. At the same time, the grave vulnerability of displaced individuals has not made the same impact on the headlines, and that is also something which I think is important to stress. The misery of war, it spreads quickly and adversely affects all aspects of the human well-being, far beyond the battlefield. And by now, the brutal Russian invasion has forcibly displaced over 5 million people. Given that the majority of those, as we said before, are women and children, and the risks of trafficking cannot be understated. And I would like to quote a statement which was made on the 12th of April. It was made by Gillian Triggs, and the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection with UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and he stated that while the generosity and solidarity towards Ukrainian refugees has been inspiring, states must prevent predatory individuals and criminal networks from exploiting the situation. And Ms. Triggs noted that UNHCR is on high alert and warning refugees on the risks of predators and criminal networks who may attempt to exploit the vulnerability or lure them with promises of free transport, accommodation, employment, or other forms of assistance. It is distressing to hear more and more concerning reports on the situation of Ukrainian refugees. And just to mention, in my own country, in Stockholm, the police has launched at least 6 preliminary inquiries of crimes against the Ukrainian refugees. The mass displacement following Russia's boundless aggression puts the capacity of European anti-trafficking measures to the test. And with the brutal invasion of Ukraine, we are faced with a human tragedy of epic proportions in the heart of Europe. But the neglect of severe humanitarian situations has been long ongoing. That is something that we know. And around the European Union lies a ring of unresolved conflicts and unattended humanitarian challenges. This is reflected in the fact that half of trafficking victims are non-European Union citizens as well. And as the OSCE encompasses the wider neighborhood of Europe, the organization is vital in achieving effective preventive and responsive actions. The OSCE is the most comprehensive forum of dialogue on the security of Europe. And while the European security architecture is under its greatest pressure in decades, we also strive to safeguard at its most fundamental human level. The Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE enables well-founded and resolute action in our common interest. The OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, which I represent, has long been engaged with work in the field of anti-trafficking, thanks largely to the tireless efforts of Congressman Chris Smith. This is always high on our agenda in the OSCE, and I can assure you the steadfast support of parliamentarians from across the OSCE region on this topic. And as a rapporteur of the OSCE Third Committee, and it's the Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions, I am about to deliver a report to our upcoming summer meeting, which will be held in July in Birmingham, where parliamentarians from all the 57 member states will meet, and we will discuss different aspects of security issues. And one of them is, of course, humanitarian rights, which we already discussed that this is what it is about. And of course, it's not impossible not to mention in this report and to give a large section of this report about the ongoing situation and suffering in Ukraine. So that is really worth mentioning, and also the risk for trafficking within our region and in our member states and within the member states of the OSCE. So with an inconceivable war in Europe, our efforts to uphold fundamental human rights have never been as important. In the face of a great upheaval, we stand firm in the conviction to ensure human dignity for all. It is my privilege to take part in this Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung conference and be informed by other politicians, by NGOs, research institutes, as well as international organizations. I'm assured in the prospects of our collective effort, and I'm of course looking forward to hear more about your thoughts on the Nordic model and how we can find more legislation and to take this fight together, because it is about basic human rights and we all need to stand united in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I hope you can take some of the messages that you've heard here today to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly this summer, because I think they're truly important ones. You've heard messages from survivor leaders, you've heard messages from those working on the ground in Ukraine, you've heard messages from other parliamentary members and representative of Council of Europe, Greta. And now I think I'd like to hand over to Luba Fine, who is going to actually discuss the Israeli route to the Nordic model with you. She's a feminist, abolitionist activist, and sex trade policy lead. She actively promoted the Nordic model in Israel, where the sex purchase ban was enforced 2 years ago. Luba is also a member of the Women's Organization Coalition Against Prostitution and Trafficking in Israel, and a volunteer in Filia, a women-led volunteer organization and part of the Women's Liberation Movement. She has currently been involved in Filia podcasts. Her series Listen to Survivors is a platform for the sex trade survivors from all over the world. So handing over to you, and if the presentation can be turned on.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Luba Fine, a sex trade abolitionist from Israel, the 8th Nordic model country. I'd like to talk today about our abolition struggle and how our knowledge and experience can contribute to the same struggle here in Germany. So now, historical context of the sex purchase ban in Israel. Israeli abolitionism began as a fight of a handful of women against the sex trafficking epidemic in Israel. In Eastern Europe, there was significant economic and political instability during the 90s. Many countries there have become the main source of the sex trafficking. Traffickers preyed upon and deceived the women from that area by promising them fair jobs in Israel. Then they smuggled those women illegally to Israel via the Egyptian border. And in Israel, the women became captives of pimps. The criminals confiscated the women's passports, they locked them in the brothels, threatened to kill their families. Some women were forced to accept up to 30 men, rapists per day. This is our past. I wish I could proudly say now that the Israeli society immediately recognized the problem and tackled it efficiently, but sadly not. The authorities, the lawmakers, the media, police ignored the problem. It was ignored for quite long. Only in 2000, in the year 2000, the former MP Zehava Gal'on has founded the Parliamentary Inquiry Committee to fight against the sex trafficking. With this inquiry committee, a coalition of activists, aid workers, members of parliament, journalists, was founded to fight the sex trafficking together. And what is interesting, that the same coalition framework, not with the same members, not a single member has stayed there, but the same coalition is active in Israel now. Since 2013, it's ceased being exclusively left-wing. We broadened this coalition, and today it includes representatives from all political parties. And it was not easy, but it was possible, because human dignity and non-violence, they are not left or right principles, they are universal. In 2008, after significant achievements in the anti-trafficking struggle, the MP Zehava Gal'on proposed a sex purchase ban bill for the first time. After numerous changes in the content of the bill and the list of its supporters, the Israeli lawmakers eventually outlawed the purchase of sex in 2018. The enforcement was planned to stay later to allow us to broaden the already existing exit services. So what happened during the, I think never mind. During the 11 years between 2008, when the bill was proposed, and 2018, when the bill passed, what happened during these 11 years? We promoted the intermediate goals. We realized that the law itself was not feasible yet, but I will give you some examples of what we did in the middle. In 2015, the war against strip clubs has started. A precedent court ruling from 2017 stated that the lap dance equals prostitution services. The ruling by the state attorney seconded that later. After several failed attempts to operate the strip clubs as dance only, local authorities closed those strip clubs completely. One more example. In 2017, we adopted a law banning websites that conduct illegal activity. This law applies to virtual brothels as well. Now, this law did not provoke riots similar to the Nordic model, but it's important is not less. In the era of online prostitution, it is very important to be able to shut those websites. And now, my favorite example of what we did in the middle. The authorities have been funding our exit services since 2008, long before the sex purchase ban passed. Since then, new services have been added every year, and the budget has gradually increased, with the most significant increase under the sex purchase ban in 2018. So today we have here you can see in my PowerPoint the list of main services. We have emergency centers for teens, care centers for adult women, long-term care hostels, emergency apartments, day centers, counseling centers, vocabulary training, mobile clinics, all for survivors of prostitution and women currently in prostitution. The most popular services include emergency assistance. Okay, emergency assistance such as food and clothing, emergency accommodation, mentoring, trauma-focused care, individual and group therapy, legal counseling, vocational training, and exercise and social rights, among many other services. Of course, we are still facing a myriad of challenges and obstacles. As the public debate concerning prostitution as violence intensifies, more and more women are motivated to turn into aid organizations. So those organizations run out of budgets and infrastructure. And we should, all the time, we have to seek more budgets. And even enforcement is still not sufficient. In the first year of actual law enforcement, the police distributed only 2,000 fines, 2,000. But despite this, we are already seeing the first effects of the law. Yes, the first effects of the law on public opinion and behavior. According to the preliminary data from the research team that accompanies the enforcement of the sex purchase ban, since the law was enacted, 18% of the sex buyers testified that they stopped paying for sex. This is not enough. This number should be 100%, right? But nevertheless, this decrease is significant, because we're speaking only about 6 months after the law was enforced. And more optimistic data, 71% of the public support the sex purchase ban now. Yeah, this is the same public that called us crazy, man haters, fanatics, only 10 years ago. And now they support us. That means we have a lot of hope. Now, how all of this can help Germany in its own fierce battle. Now, it turns out that Germany also deals with the sex trafficking problem. In January 2021 was published a report by an ex-officer, Helmut Sporer, a specialist in prostitution and human trafficking in Germany. And as many of you already know, the report showed a bleak picture. For example, Sporer wrote that most women in prostitution are there against their will. The report also stated that there is no reason to fear the development of underground sex trade in Germany as a consequence of the Nordic model, because there is already underground sex trade in the formal prostitution establishments. And now, due to the war in Ukraine, Europe is flooded with young refugee women. and hence the exploitation of desperate women might increase and worsen. Similar to Israel in the late 90s, an alarm clock is currently ringing for Germany. And the status of Israel in Germany is indeed different. In Israel, the sex trade has never been legalized, and we had no open borders with poorer countries. But Germany also has advantages, a robust welfare system, efficiency, and the proximity to Nordic model countries that allows for cooperation. Of course, your path to success is still rocky, long and hard, and so is ours. But the bell has already rung, and you know what they say, you cannot unring it. Implementation, the Nordic model in this country will cause a vast global change. And with these amazing people that I see here, the abolitionists, activists, sex trade survivor leaders, members of parliament, I know that you can lead this change. Thank you.
I think we have done actually our round now from starting with Germany to concluding with Germany through now the root of also the example of Israel and the journey of change, actually social change, which resulted from the change of legislation and policy. And I've personally visited Israel a number of times actually since this change, and I've seen even the difference on the street in red light districts and such, or what was formerly red light districts. You barely actually see the issue. And I congratulate you for all of your work actually in Israel in making that change. And with that, actually, I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience here. And I will also pose some questions from our audience online in addition. So if you have a question to any of the panelist members here, please raise your hand and a microphone will be provided to you. If there are no questions here, actually, I will actually ask a question of all of the panelists. What I would like to ask you is the following. We are all sitting here in Germany. We do understand that Germany is a destination country for sex trafficking victims. And we're all coming from different perspectives here, from the governmental perspective, intergovernmental organization perspective, civil society perspective, and also another intergovernmental perspective. So different countries, different perspectives. You know, what would you advise actually in terms of policy and law change in Germany to address the demand for sex trafficking here, as well as the flow of sex trafficking victims to Germany? And if maybe, should we start with the left side, Kevin?
So I think that the policy should be broad. It should look at a number of issues. First of all, the vulnerability and the demand, which we've heard quite a detail here on. But I think also it needs to look at the finances that are generated. The reason why people traffic is for money. So how do we manage to stop that and make that something that people don't want to do? And how do we take that money and give that money back, reparation to the victims? We also need to make sure that the policies have non-punishment principles, so that, you know, countries can't find a way to punish the people, for example, deport them. For example, if they commit document offences because of their trafficking, that they're dealt with for some other crime that they've dealt with. I, as a police officer, made sure that any victims of trafficking we dealt with were not prosecuted. That was a challenge because others would disagree with me, but thankfully I was in charge and that was what would happen, even when prosecutors disagreed with me. So there are ways that the policies need to be seen as being supportive to the victim and also challenging to the person who wants to commit this crime. But one of the most important things is they have to be proactive. They have to be funded properly so that when operations, whether it's civil society, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, these are become part of the business as usual of the state, and responses are properly funded. Because if there isn't the funding there, if it isn't built into the system and the business as usual, it will fall off after funding runs out or after the interest runs out. And that's one of the biggest problems with so much around the human trafficking agenda, is everything's short term, everything's funded either through an EU project or some small project that's there, when we know this is a crime that's been around for years and years and is going to be around for a long time. So crimes need to be trauma-informed, looking at vulnerability, how they approach the criminality or the causes, and then also working with countries of source, particularly if you're looking at international development budgets. And obviously Germany is a big player in that. How can it look at how its international budget can actually start to stem things at source through education, through creating more human rights, through better democracy, through influencing policy in source countries, which I know in Nigeria we worked on extensively. And we've now seen prosecutions in Edo State where there'd been no budgets, no funding, no processes. And the first conviction we managed to see there through a collaborative work was of a judge in Edo State, which I'm sure you'd be able to say would never have happened 5 years ago, because nobody would go near a judge.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And if I could pass the floor to you, Elizabeth.
Ja, ich denke, das Ziel, der Königsweg wird sein, dass wir weiter dafür kämpfen, das nordische Modell einzuführen. Und dafür brauchen wir ein geändertes Narrativ in der Gesellschaft. Denn wie gesagt, es gibt zum einen das Narrativ der Prostitutionslobby, die sehr stark darauf abstellt, auf die vielleicht kleinen Prozentzahlen von Anbietern, die es wirklich freiwillig und selbstbestimmt machen und damit natürlich auch auf einer ganz anderen Ebene, mit einer ganz anderen Praxis sozusagen ihre Berufung ausüben, wenn ich mal so in Anführungszeichen sprechen darf. Es fällt übrigens auf, dass viele Aktivistinnen auf der Seite eben nicht diese geschilderten typischen Schicksale erleiden, sondern zum Beispiel als Dominas unterwegs sind und dann meinen, sie könnten über Prostitution reden. Ja, also eine ganz, ganz andere Situation. Wir müssen denen, die es aus einer feministischen Haltung heraus befürwortet haben, zu der Situation zu kommen oder zu der Gesetzeslage zu kommen, die wir jetzt haben, denen müssen wir sagen, es ist ein sehr überraschendes Ergebnis von Feminismus, wenn jetzt junge Frauen dazu gezwungen werden, sozusagen im Prinzip das zu tun, sexuelle Dienstleistungen ohne Grenzen letztendlich ausführen zu müssen an machistischsten Männern. Ja, das ist ein überraschendes Ergebnis von Feminismus, dass das jetzt in der Praxis zigtausendfach stattfindet. Das muss man klar machen und deshalb ist es wichtig, dass wir so eine Veranstaltung haben wie hier heute und dass es Menschen gibt, die sagen, ich bin dazu gezwungen worden und ich erzähle jetzt darüber, weil ich glaube, dass viele, die eben nicht so nah dran sind, sich das gar nicht vorstellen können. Es ist nicht so, dass das befürwortet wird, sondern es ist einfach so, dass sich viele kein Bild davon machen, was wirklich abgeht. Und das Bild in der Öffentlichkeit wird leider sehr stark geprägt von diesen, die dieses andere Narrativ befürworten. Das müssen wir schaffen und das muss uns auch als Gesetzgeber, die es letztendlich entscheiden können, dazu führen, dass wir die Mehrheiten bekommen. Ich würde es ja sofort machen, aber wir brauchen eben die Mehrheit, die sich damit beschäftigt und zu dem Ergebnis kommen. Ich bin mir ganz, ganz sicher, wenn wir es schaffen, werden wir kurz darauf auch im Rückblick sagen, wie konnten wir so lange mit der anderen Situation umgehen? Wie konnten wir das zulassen? Und manchmal gelingt es auch, für Missstände eine Aufmerksamkeit zu erwerben, die genau zu dieser Reaktion führt. Wir hatten vor 2 Jahren, als im ersten Corona-Jahr zum Beispiel aufgedeckt, wie die Situation von Menschen in der Fleischindustrie ist. Da gibt es nämlich auch teilweise Situationen, dass Menschen aus Osteuropa dann praktisch im Umfeld des Schlachthofs dann leben, auch sehr prekär leben und da auch in einer gewissen Form ausgebeutet werden. Und da hat es dann auch eine Initiative gegeben, das zu verbessern. Ich habe immer gesagt, ja, ist richtig, aber schaut doch mal auf die, bei denen die Ausbeutung noch viel existenzieller ist als dort. Wieso machen wir das nicht auch hier und schauen dahin und verbieten das? So, also es ist einerseits ein positives Beispiel, weil sich auch mal Dinge bewegen können, wenn das Ausmaß des Unrechts mal wirklich auch in das öffentliche Licht kommt. Also deshalb ist es möglich, aber es hat eben noch nicht das Ausmaß, also nein, das Unrecht der Prostitution, was wir haben in Deutschland, eben noch nicht unter das Licht gestellt. Und es gibt etliche, die da zusammenarbeiten und wir müssen da vielleicht noch koordinierter zusammen vorgehen. Helmut Sporer ist schon benannt worden. Er ist einer der ganz, ganz wichtigen Ermittler und Aufdecker und Kämpfer in diesem Themenbereich. Bin ihm sehr, sehr dankbar und ich würde auch sagen, dass er auch mich dazu gebracht hat, da anders hinzusehen und zu sagen, das kann doch alles nicht wahr sein, was in Deutschland stattfindet. Also wir müssen weiter darüber reden, wir müssen das Bewusstsein schärfen und an den Mehrheiten weiterkämpfen.
Thank you so much. Helmut Spohr was a great contributor to the conference last year, actually. So we're also very much appreciative of his efforts. And just to add to what you were saying, my husband is actually German. And we have these discussions on trafficking and sex trafficking actually as well. And he's in business. And what he says that any corporation that had this homicide rate, that had broken bones, various violence and abuse, etc., would be shut down like this. So why are we still operating brothels and places where women and, and sometimes even children are abused, and they're open and they're considered a business and a type of work? Because in any regular business with all of this, it could not be possible. They'd be shut down with fines, people going to jail and such. And here we have it freely in our society. And before I take more questions from the audience, I would like to actually turn to you for the same question.
Thank you so much. And I think that we all can agree in here that those who are exploited by prostitution, by trafficking, are vulnerable groups in almost all of the cases, and also that it is an actual exploitation going on, and that we need to take political means to fight against it and to do it together. That's why I'm happy or glad to hear that Ms. Winkelmeyer-Becker is going to fight for this also here in Germany, because I think it's a really good step if I compare it to the situation almost 20 years ago when I was a youth politician. When the Nordic model or the Swedish law was enforced, it was quite controversial, both in Sweden but also out of an international perspective. And we can now see that it is not so controversial anymore. And I welcome very much that we have this debate here today, that we exchange experiences on how we do it in different countries, how we can learn from each other, and also can change the legislation in some countries and also in Germany. And I agree what you said before, that if Germany would take this step, that would be we would be a couple of countries that would be role models for the rest of the world. And I think that would be a really, really important step. Having that said, we of course must admit that we have huge problems at home, even what kind of legislation we have. So when the politicians are agreeing up on that this is the problem and they have the guts to do the changes that are needed, we also must influence, of course, the population in our countries, the attitudes towards this problem, to point out that there is vulnerability in these groups that are being exploited. Still, in Sweden today, I meet many people saying, but there are people who are happy being prostitutes because they have chosen it themselves. And as from what we heard today, we know that this is not the case. So we need to start changing attitudes, and I think that is something we need to start doing early. We need to include these perspectives in the sex education, for example, in schools. There was a election in Hungary a couple of weeks ago where they had this referendum on should we include sex education and talk about LGBTQ people and so on. And the referendum was not accepted, thankfully, but still there is a majority not including sex education in many countries. And I think this perspective also must be included when it comes to sex education, and to talk about vulnerability, to talk about what is the actual case in our countries and what we can meet, because we know that we heard from the Israeli example that 20% of all the men sometime went to a prostitute or that they exploited someone. And I think not everyone, because there are all classes, all age groups that do this, but I also know that there are also many young men who are doing this, even as young as 17, 18, 19, 20. And if we can start already in schools, we might change the attitudes from an early age and to give hope for the future when it comes to this. So that was what I wanted to say. There are, of course, many more perspectives, but yeah, thank you for now.
Thank you so much. And as we are continuing, I mean, one of the panels that we will have tomorrow is actually trafficking for the purposes of pornography production. And the fact that so many young boys actually perceive this as a norm to go and purchase other human beings for their sexual gratification. And also from the reports that we have from survivors actually participate in really violent acts it's also something that they're getting socialized by the pornography industry, actually, to say that this is okay. So that's one of the things that will be discussed also tomorrow.
Thank you. I mean, very many valid points were raised about demand and, advice for Germany. But I think if you start talking about or using demand as a lens through which, you understand human trafficking, if this narrative kind of succeeds, then I think all other political measures, revisions on the legislation and so on might come more naturally. But operationally speaking, I would really like to highlight that Germany today lacks a national referral mechanism. They have set up one, or are setting up one, as I understand, which is bilateral with Bulgaria, which is of course very good. But this is very, very necessary, operationally speaking, for authorities and organizations. And as said before, the state has the main responsibility here. So this initiative should and must come from the state. Also, I would like to add that when you introduce NRMs or national action plans against human trafficking, and I'm speaking to decision makers, please guarantee earmarked funding. Because what we see, for example, in countries that have quite successful national referral mechanisms, we see that there's a huge blockage very often with law enforcement, with the police, because while other state agencies during that process become better at identifying victims of human trafficking, they refer the cases to the police, who cannot keep up, and you have all these preliminary investigations piling up at the different police stations. So earmarked funding is the most crucial aspect in order to kind of implement the structures you're producing. As a final remark, I also want to give a compliment to Germany, because Germany also is doing more and more things when it comes to human trafficking. And I really welcome Germany setting up at the moment a national rapporteur, an independent national rapporteur, which I understand is being set up at the Institute for Human Rights. And this is very welcomed, especially in a country like Germany with different Länder and quite, high local, regional administrative independence. It's important that kind of how big the problem is and that you can follow tendencies, developments, and so on. So these are my advice. Thanks.
So much for that valuable advice, and I'll jump on that advice and say that the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, as has been mentioned already, has released updated guidance on the national referral mechanism, and one of its mandates is to support OSCE participating states in developing and strengthening national referral mechanisms, and we're happy to support Germany's efforts to do so. And with that, actually, I would like to take a question from the audience. And if you could raise your hand so that the mic will come to you.
Ja, mein Name ist Gudula Kozak. Ich bin die Vorsitzende von Terre des Femmes, Menschenrechte für die Frau, die größte Frauenrechtsorganisation in Deutschland. Und wir kämpfen seit, ich glaube, 6 Jahren sehr intensiv für die Durchsetzung des nordischen Modells. Wir werden unglaublich angefeindet dafür in der Gesellschaft. Es ist nicht nur so, dass da die Prostitutionslobby irgendwo agiert und in Parlamenten oder so dagegen spricht, sondern wir werden richtig diskriminiert angefeindet. Wir kriegen also zum Teil Bündnisse. Wir werden aus Bündnissen ausgeschlossen, weil wir Sexarbeiterinnen feindlich sind. Wir werden Kooperationen wird gekündigt wegen Sexarbeiterfeindlichkeit. Es ist eine unglaublich bösartige Atmosphäre auch in den Zeitungen, wenn da diffamierend über uns geschrieben wird und wir geben eine Gegendarstellung, wird es oft nicht veröffentlicht, also nicht überall, aber gerade auch von links kommend, von sogenannten Feministinnen, ja, und die also da immer noch eine Selbstbestimmung der Frau drin sehen. Und das finde ich, also ist eine ganz schlimme Atmosphäre, die hoffentlich bald umschlägt. Und dann möchte ich aber auch noch einen anderen Punkt machen, wenn wir Aufklärung machen, ja, dann ist es ganz, ganz wichtig, auch die Männer zu adressieren, denn gehen wir davon aus, dass 80-90% der Frauen in diesem im Milieu unfreiwillig aus Zwang dieser Tätigkeit nachgehen, dann bedeutet das, dass jeder Mann, der Sex konsumiert, der eine Frau kauft, davon ausgehen muss, dass sie das nicht aus freien Stücken tut. Also auch die Männer müssen mit ins Boot geholt werden in der Aufklärung. Willst du das wirklich? Also es gibt natürlich dieses Rotlicht-Aus-Bündnis, das hat zum Beispiel adressiert auch die Männer mit den Postkarten und mit solchen Sprüchen, dein Vergnügen ist mein Horror. Aber da muss die Gesellschaft eben auch noch wirklich anders umdenken. Und ich finde, Narrativ ändern ist einfach zu schwach ausgedrückt. Ja, es muss ein wirkliches Umdenken in der Gesellschaft stattfinden, in der Masse der Gesellschaft. Wir haben noch nicht die Mehrheit hinter uns für dieses Modell.
Das kann ich nur bestätigen. Also wir sind ja ein Bündnis gemeinsam gegen Menschenhandel und auch nicht alle unserer Mitglieder sind jetzt explizit für das nordische Modell. Aber manche sind offiziell nicht deswegen dafür, weil sie genau diese Erfahrung machen. Wer sich dazu bekennt sozusagen, das machen möchte, der wird ausgeschlossen von anderen Netzwerken, von Kooperationen vor Ort. Das ist leider genau die Erfahrung. Und ich glaube, dass das sehr wichtig ist, an der Stelle weiter zu bleiben, dran zu bleiben. Wir haben ja so ein kleines Büchlein, wo Frau Winkelmeier-Becker auch einen Beitrag geschrieben hat zum nordischen Modell, gerade rausgegeben, haben das allen Bundestagsabgeordneten zur Verfügung gestellt. Das kann man hier draußen auch mitnehmen. Und ich denke, das wird Kerngegenstand der Debatte sein müssen. Und gleichzeitig muss man wissen, wenn man sich dazu explizit äußert, dass der Gegenwind eben massiv ist. Können wir leider nur bestätigen. Ich würde gerne auch nochmal diesen Gedanken aufnehmen, was die Situation der Männer angeht. Es ist wirklich so, eins der faszinierenden Sachen am nordischen Modell ist, dass sich das Bewusstsein von jungen Männern in Schweden und anderen Ländern geändert hat. Man geht zum 18. Geburtstag eben nicht mehr ins Bordell. Das ist nicht schick, das ist nichts Besonderes, sondern dass tatsächlich ein gesellschaftliches Klima für die Wertschätzung von Sexualität, Sie haben das vorhin so schön gesagt, auch in der Beziehung, in der Partnerschaft, wo gehört das eigentlich hin, da eine Rolle spielt. Und dass das rauskommt aus dieser muffigen, verklemmten Moralecke, sondern schlicht und ergreifend eine Frage von Menschenwürde und Frauenrechten ist, das finde ich total wichtig. Weil solange das nur kommt, ja irgendwelche Konservativen sind der Meinung, man muss halt irgendwie einem Partner treu sein oder so, wird sich nicht durchsetzen. Wenn wir das aber argumentativ an der Stelle der Frauenrechte und der Menschenwürde ansetzen, dann glaube ich, haben wir eine große Chance.
Thank you so much for those comments. I think Kevin just wanted to add a thought to what you were saying actually right now as well.
Yes, just briefly, I met with somebody who was running for office in the United States, and they were advocating for the fact that prostitution, regulated and pro-prostitution, would be a better stance. So I said to them, well, what I would ask you to do is yourself as a male, or your wife, or your children, or your sisters, why don't you get one of those to go and try it and come and speak about it? And I said, because, you know, I've gone and tried homelessness, or we may go and experience a job. Politicians very often go and look at jobs, but let's get somebody to go and experience it themselves. And they wouldn't have to go all the way or whatever, but they could have a night of somebody coming in drunk, somebody coming in who is not, you know, mentally unstable, and see what that's like, and then stand in a parliament and explain what that was like. Maybe 20 people during a night, and explain what that's like. And I will draw back on William Wilberforce, who ended slavery in the transatlantic slave trade. He made an expression, if it's not good enough for me, then it's not good enough for anyone. So let's get some politicians to go out there, experience it, then come and speak in your parliament and tell you what it's like.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I have actually a question for Luba. Actually, a couple of questions for her from the online audience. So I'll start with the first one. I'm a trained machine designer and informatics engineer, but I found my dream job in sex work. A general ban on buying sex would take away my livelihood and the right to practice my profession freely, and I would never accept that. In this case, like many of my colleagues in my home country, France, I would simply continue to work illegally. Honestly, is that the solution? Is a sex purchase ban the panacea for all problems?
So to this question, when we pass laws, we never speak about one person. Every law should be checked and considered in, we need a macro analysis. So what we have in macro analysis, in the framework with legalized prostitution, like in Germany, we have people in prostitution. Even under the Nordic model, we are not naive. We know that we can never eliminate prostitution completely, just like we cannot eliminate rape or theft or murder. So under the Nordic model, some people will still work in prostitution. So this particular individual can keep working in prostitution. Now she says, I will be forced to work illegally. But now in Germany, we refer to Helmut Spohr's report about 60 to 90% of women work here in prostitution illegally and against their will. So this is the situation of 90 or maybe slightly less % of women under legalized prostitution. So we cannot discuss this particular individual as important as she is. We have to speak about the macro situation. So many people work illegally under legalized prostitution and under the Nordic model. But under the Nordic model, the size of prostitution shrinks because the demand shrinks, and we have less people in prostitution, including the illegal one. And what is extremely important to say, that she said she's designer or engineer, sorry, I forgot. But she is not the target audience of the sex buyers. The sex buyers target very, very young and new girls. They target underage girls. We all know when they call to brothels and they call to prostitution establishments, they never say, send us your most experienced designer. They always ask, who is the youngest one and who is the new one? So they always create a demand for more and more girls. And the situation, the situation is tragic. And many of those women are harmed by prostitution. Some women who are extremely harmed, they are completely dysfunctioning in the beginning of their prostitution career. They believe that prostitution is a good job for them. So Nordic model indeed is an extremely paternalistic law. Many laws are paternalistic. Universal healthcare is paternalistic. But we also have to take this into account, that many women who claim that prostitution is my dream job, they ended up ill, dysfunctioning, unstable, addicted to drugs. And that's why when we implement the macro analysis, we have to pass this law.
It is also important to note, actually, in addition to what you have said, that neither of the models actually seeks to criminalize women in prostitution. And that's something that actually is not reiterated enough. The only difference, at least in my personal view, is the fact that one seeks to criminalize the demand, the men, and the other one does not. Both seek to protect women and not criminalize women as such. But one model addresses demand and the other one does not. But with that, actually, I have another question for Luba, which is the following. Germany earns from human trafficking through tax revenues from prostitution. How can a change take place? How can Israel help us?
Okay, so according to this topic, I have already mentioned that the situation in Israel and Germany is different. Israel was never famous for its brothels, and we never had legalized brothels. And this situation where the sex trade money flows to the state coffers, which is coffers, sorry. Okay, so this is indeed challenging. So I have my answer has two parts. One is moral and the other one is more practical. So morally, yes, the sex trade, it creates money. But this money, this income, it has its price. And what is its price morally? Again, let's refer to Helmut Sporer's report. Those 60, 70, 80, maybe 90% of Eastern European, African, maybe Thai and other women who are held here in the brothels, in official brothels against their will. This is the price of this income. Many of those women have no access to the public welfare system because they are foreigners, because they are illegal, because they don't have maybe health insurance. So they pay the price for this income. So morally, I think that no income can justify this suffering of these women. And more practically, just what you can do to convince the policymakers, try to make some analysis, try to translate this harm into numbers, like what impact prostitution has, legalized sex trade has on the public health system. In the areas of prostitution, the public very often is not safe. People don't have safe. There are a lot of prostitution-related crime activities, like drug dealers usually surround the prostitution business. Very often illegal loans surround prostitution business. You know, I have interviewed for my own research, I have interviewed several dozens of survivors, and women told me that the criminals offer them illegal loans with very high interest, and when they're not able to repay those loans, they sell them to prostitution so they can pay the loans. So there are a lot of crime around. Even legal prostitution business can have the same problem. So maybe you need to monetize the harm.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as we have run out of time, we're just going to turn to one or two last questions before our short break.
Thank you. First of all, my first question would have been on the fact of education. So you've already covered that. Thank you very much. The other question is, I think the topic was raised about where the money goes, or the money about human trafficking in general. Could you maybe say a bit more on that, what the situation is in Germany? Maybe if there is anything towards preventing or diminishing that, and maybe on the situation in general, what the current knowledge is on that?
Kevin, would you like to answer that?
So you raise a very important area there, and there's a UN Liechtenstein initiative which talks about the money and finance and investors, for example. You know, when there's big investment being made by an investment group, how much is due diligence is done before there is supply chain checking. And there's other things that I've called for, like, for example, when migrant workers move from one place to another, and this is something we are seeing an approach with the Ukrainians, for example, but is it being properly done? Is that, say, for example, there's an enormous amount of workers go from Vietnam to Taiwan, but they don't get bank accounts. There's no bank that will give them bank accounts. So they're paid and their remittances are sent back through, you know, ways that they pay 9% to get it back, or that they may have to have other deductions made. Whereas if they had a bank account, the money would be transferred straight into a bank account back to the family. The money would go back, and then they would get a credit rating when they eventually go home 1 or 2 years later. So we're looking at it so not in a policy-led approach, not in the way that we do finance around the world, the way that money transfers. And it was a lawyer said to me recently, when they as a firm get a notice that money may have been touched by terrorism, the company almost has to stand still, and they have to make sure that that money isn't going there anymore, or if it does, they have to report it, and they have to make sure, and they will spend a fortune on that. If they get told it's human trafficking, they go, oh, well, let's get, you know, do something on a Tuesday afternoon and get some people in and talk about it if we're not busy. So there's not the same seriousness, and they're streets apart. But also things like money that's tainted. If we look at, you know, brothels have been there for years in London, I'm talking about, and they're just known as being historic brothels for decades. And of course, operations are done, sometimes about trafficking, sometimes about, you know, controlling prostitution for gain. And that ends up with the women sometimes suffering and ending up being deported sometimes even. Well, what about the people that are making the real money, the owners of these premises that are charging £300 or £400 a shift, and they've got 4, so £1,600 a day for this property? And then there's cases where these are recorded sometimes as student accommodation, or even on occasions diplomatic premises. All of this is going on, and we're not looking at it in a really serious policy-led approach like we do other serious organized crime. And the thing is, it's all there to be found out. When I was running operations, we would go and look at airline tickets. You know, we saw regular bookings of one way for women. That was something we would then focus on. That was a red flag to us. And it led to enormous operations where we ended up identifying hundreds of women who were trafficked for sexual exploitation. And the money was then going all around the world. So that's how organized this is. But the way we're looking at it now on a case-by-case process, going back to your point, we need to look at it on a macro level. We need to start finding where that 150 million is going, billion, should I say, and prevent it. And that includes within the legitimate economy, because there's a lot of businesses making money at this as well.
Thank you, Kevin. And just to be clear, sex trafficking, so from the 150 billion profit, 2/3 of it are from sex trafficking. So 99 billion a year is from sex trafficking. So this is where the money is for criminals in general. So one last final question before we take our break.
It's a very short question. I am Kate Imaswen. I run Great Africa Network for Women, working on human trafficking across Nigeria and here in Berlin. My question is very short and brief. And this is to say, what can whistleblower policy be a part of, can it be a measure in fighting human trafficking? The whistleblower option, can it be a policy in fighting human trafficking? Because it's shrouded around secrecy and people don't talk about it. Even victims cannot really talk about who have trafficked them. So if the whistleblower policy is introduced into human trafficking as a measure, can it really curb human trafficking?
I think Kevin would like to take
I'll just give you a short Absolutely, yes. And in some companies, that's exactly what they've done. A whistleblower policy with a safety that you're not going to be penalized in any way. And I think that that's exactly what we need. We need to be able to call it out and feel safe about calling it out. And then, like the policies, and some of them have them in legislation. For example, Ireland has a disclosure legislation about if you raise something, particularly when it's involving the state, you won't be sanctioned for it if you've made a genuine error. So whistleblower policies can really encourage people, particularly in workplaces, but we do need them to consider them in areas like, women who are exploited in sexual exploitation. How do they call for help? How do they actually step out of the shadows and safely say it may not be they want to speak to police? Very often they won't want to speak to police. Who is it that can actually be the person that whistleblower will call? And really realize that it'll be safe and it'll be properly funded and it'll be properly have resources so that people can be supported and rescued and dealt with in a very professional, trauma-informed way.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And with that, I would like to end this panel a little bit late, and thank all the panelists actually for their incredible contributions to this very critical discussion, actually, not just for Germany, but for the whole of the EU and the OSCE region as a whole. With that, we're going to take a 30-minute break. So for those that are online, please tune in or don't disconnect and stay online. We will be back in 30 minutes with a very exciting panel of survivor leaders. And I think this is something that is at the heart of all of this, and we really, really hope that you stay on and participate and listen. So we will see you back in 30 minutes from now. Thank you.